The kingdom of Vanthul was known not only for its prosperity, but also for its king, Aldric, a man of great intelligence and charisma, yet consumed by one obsession: immortality. Since his youth, Aldric had heard tales of heroes and emperors who had accomplished great feats, only to fade away into the pages of history. He feared being just another forgotten name in the sands of time, a soul lost in the vast darkness of death. To his subjects, Aldric seemed to have everything: a prosperous kingdom, a loyal court, and a guaranteed future. But to the king, all of this seemed trivial in the face of the inevitability of death. He saw life as a race against time, and the cruelest fate was knowing that, no matter how great his deeds, he too would fall into the shadow of death. He could not bear the thought of his name being erased. It was on a stormy night that Aldric's fate took a dark turn. While perusing ancient texts and alchemical books in his library, he came across a reference to the Grimoire of Oscath, an ancient book whose pages were protected by a spell. It was said that whoever deciphered its secrets would be able to make a pact with an ancient entity, gaining immortality in exchange for their soul. Aldric was determined. No warning from priests or scholars could stop him. He awoke in the dead of night, when most were asleep, and had the grimoire brought to the castle. The magic that emanated from the book was palpable, electrifying the air around him. The words, written in a forgotten language, began to reveal themselves to the king. He knew he was about to make an irreversible decision. But his desire was greater than any fear he might feel. The quest for immortality would take him into the very darkness he feared. But none of that mattered now, for the power to live forever seemed to be the only answer to his internal torment.
The ritual was set for the darkest of nights, when the stars seemed hidden and the full moon cast only a faint light over the land. Aldric, now alone in his main hall, prepared the spell with meticulous care. On the cold stone floor, he drew circles and mystical symbols with red ink, a liquid he had prepared himself from rare ingredients. The room was heavy with the fragrance of burning herbs and resins. He trembled with anticipation and fear, but his resolve was unwavering. Around the circle, 4 artifacts were placed: a silver blade, a vial of blood from a rare creature, the essence of a night-blooming flower that only grew in the most distant mountains, and finally, a lunar stone, a relic brought from a forbidden land. Everything was ready. At the foot of the altar, Aldric recited the words from the grimoire, which sounded like a distant echo. Each word seemed to scrape at his soul, causing his body to pulse with an unknown energy. The sound of his voice reverberated through the walls of the castle, but soon a chill began to fill the air, as if the very atmosphere was distorting. Then the hall was flooded with light that seemed not of this world. In the center of the circle, a shadow began to materialize, with fluid, indistinct shapes that slowly took form. The entity appeared before him, cloaked in black mist and light, with eyes that glowed like falling stars. Its presence was imposing, and Aldric felt a shiver run down his spine, but he did not hesitate. The entity spoke with a voice that echoed in his mind. "What do you desire, King Aldric? Eternal life? The gift of mastering time? Such gifts are not given without cost. Are you prepared to pay the price?" With a fixed gaze, Aldric replied, "Yes, I accept the pact. "Immortality is mine, no matter the cost." The entity smiled, an inhuman smile, and extended its shadowy hands. When the king touched them, a searing pain shot through his body, as if his flesh was being torn apart and reassembled. He felt his bones expand and contract, and his mind stretched, absorbing ancient and forbidden knowledge. It was a sensation of absolute power, but at the same time, something essential was being taken from him. The warmth of life, empathy, and humanity were slowly draining away, replaced by an ever-growing darkness. When the ritual ended, Aldric was alone again. He looked at his hands, now colder and paler, and a profound sense of emptiness filled his heart. The pact was complete. He was immortal, but with every beat of his heart, a part of his soul seemed to fade, transforming into something distant, something he could no longer control. The immortality he had sought was now a prison that would keep him alive forever, but at the cost of his humanity.
In the days that followed the ritual, Aldric could feel the effects of his new existence. At first, he felt invincible, a strange and overwhelming sense of power flooding his veins. His body had changed in subtle ways, becoming stronger, more resilient, but at a cost. His once youthful features began to wither, and his skin took on a pale, almost translucent hue. The king no longer needed sleep nor sustenance, but something essential was slipping away from him. The people of Vantel, who had once adored their monarch, now began to whisper behind his back. His eyes had grown too cold, too distant, and his presence no longer commanded the same respect. The king was not the same man they had once known. His court, once filled with joy and laughter, had turned silent, his servants avoiding him in fear, and even his closest allies began to distance themselves. It wasn't just his appearance that changed. Aldric felt his mind slowly slipping away. Memories of his youth, of his beloved queen, and even his friends seemed to fade into nothingness, replaced by dark visions and nightmares. He began to hear voices in his head, whispers that told him of things he could not fully understand, promises of greater power, but also threats of eternal torment if he did not obey. Every time Aldric looked into the mirror, the reflection staring back at him seemed more like a stranger than the man who had once ruled with compassion. His own image was becoming distorted, like a mask he could no longer remove. The curse of immortality was beginning to take root, and he realized, too late, that he had traded his soul for eternal life.
Months passed, and Aldric withdrew further into the castle, shutting himself away from the world. His people, who had once celebrated him, now feared his very presence. News of his strange condition spread across the kingdom, and rumors of the king's madness began to take hold. He had become a ghost of his former self, wandering the halls of his castle in solitude, his mind increasingly consumed by dark thoughts. No one dared to approach him, not even his most trusted advisors, They had seen the once great king now reduced to a shell, lost to the curse he had embraced. Aldric's heart, which had once been full of pride and ambition, had turned hollow, and the weight of his immortality began to crush him from the inside out. He no longer cared about ruling, about the welfare of his people. He only wanted to understand the price of his immortality and whether there was any hope of redemption. One cold evening, as the castle stood silent in the darkness, Aldric sat alone in his chamber, staring at the flickering flame of a candle. His thoughts were clouded, his mind lost in a maze of regret and despair. He realized that the curse he had sought to escape was now his prison, a prison where time no longer passed, where joy no longer existed. He could never die, never find peace, and he had no one to share his torment with. His kingdom was falling apart, the crops were failing, and the once loyal knights had begun to question his rule. The subjects, once loyal to their king, now looked to the heavens for guidance, fearing that the curse had spread through the land. Aldric's kingdom, now withering under the weight of his decisions, had begun to unravel. And yet the king felt something stir deep within him, a voice, a presence, calling him back to the dark path he had started upon. The entity that had granted him immortality had not disappeared. It was still there, whispering promises of greater power, of a chance to regain everything he had lost. The only question was, at what cost?
One stormy night, as Aldric wandered the empty halls of his castle, a figure appeared at the door of his chamber. Cloaked in tattered robes, the man was old and frail, with eyes that glowed with an unsettling knowledge. His presence felt unnatural, almost as if he were not fully bound by the laws of time and space. Aldric, weary and distant, looked at the stranger with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse from years of silence. The old man did not answer at first, instead stepping closer, his eyes scanning the king as if searching for something hidden deep within him. "I know what you seek, King Aldric," the old man said, his voice low and rasping, "and I know what you have become." Aldric's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of something, a memory, a fragment of his former self. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cracking. The old man continued, his eyes never leaving the king's face. "I have come to offer you a way out. The entity you bargained with, its power is not unlimited. You can still free yourself from its grip, but it will require great sacrifice." Aldric's mind raced. Could it be true? Could there be a way to reverse the curse, to restore his humanity? His thoughts turned to the entity whose whispers had become a constant presence in his mind, filling him with dark promises. Was there a way to undo it all? "You cannot break the pact easily," the old man warned, sensing the king's rising hope. "But there is a place, a land forgotten by time, where you might find the means to sever your connection to the entity. You must journey there, alone, and face the trials that await you. Only then can you be free." The king felt a surge of determination, but a deep, gnawing fear followed quickly.
Could he truly escape the curse that had taken everything from him? Could he face the horrors ahead? "Where is this place?" Aldric asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Far from here, in a realm where the boundaries between life and death blur. You must seek it, but beware. If you fail, your soul will be lost forever." With those words, the old man turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Aldric with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain: the path ahead would be perilous. The curse had already taken so much from him. Now he would risk everything to reclaim his humanity.
The next morning, Aldric prepared for a journey he had never imagined. His body, still bearing the marks of the curse, felt heavier than ever. He knew that leaving the castle would mean stepping into the unknown, but the prospect of facing the entity and possibly breaking the pact was the only thing that gave him any hope of redemption. Before he left, Aldric called together a small group of loyal soldiers, those who had stood by him through his darkest moments. They were hesitant, their eyes filled with concern as they gazed upon their once great king, now a shadow of his former self. "Your Majesty," one of the soldiers spoke, his voice trembling, "we cannot let you go alone. The world beyond the castle is dangerous. You will need us." But Aldric refused their help. "I must go alone," he said, with a finality that made his soldiers recoil. "This is a journey I must take by myself. The curse was mine to bear, and it will be mine to undo." With that, he left the castle, stepping into the wild, untamed lands beyond his kingdom. The forest surrounding the castle seemed darker now, as though even nature itself had turned against him. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the sky overhead seemed perpetually overcast, as if the world was holding its breath. As Aldric ventured deeper into the wilderness, the oppressive silence around him grew heavier. He had no map, no guide, only the cryptic words of the old man to guide him. The path he walked was long and treacherous, filled with shadowy figures that lurked just beyond the edges of his vision. The further he went, the more he felt the pull of the entity, its whispers growing louder in his mind, tempting him with promises of more power, more freedom, if only he would submit to its will. But Aldric resisted. With each step, he grew more determined, even as his body weakened and the toll of immortality wore him down. He knew that if he did not find the place the old man spoke of, he would be lost forever, consumed by the very darkness he had once sought to control. For days he traveled, pushing himself through the desolate landscape. Hunger and fatigue began to set in, but he pressed on. His only companions were the memories of his past life, the king he once was, the man who had loved and led with compassion. That man now seemed like a distant dream, but Aldric clung to those memories, using them as fuel to continue his journey. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Aldric came upon a clearing. At the center stood an ancient stone monument, weathered and cracked by the passage of time. The air around it felt different, charged, as though some invisible force was emanating from the stones. This, Aldric realized, was the place he had been searching for. But as he approached the monument, the ground beneath his feet trembled. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. He was not alone. The trials were beginning.
Aldric stood in the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. The ancient stone monument loomed before him, the air thick with an unnatural energy. For a moment, everything around him seemed to pause, silent, still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. But then the ground beneath his feet trembled again, and a deep, guttural growl rumbled from the depths of the forest. From the shadows Creatures emerged, dark, twisted beings that seemed to have no true form, only shifting shadows and glowing eyes. They surrounded Aldric, their movements fluid and predatory, as if they were drawn to the very essence of his immortality. Aldric reached for his sword, but his hand trembled, the weight of his powerlessness pressing down on him. These creatures were not of this world. They were remnants of the entity's influence, sent to test him, to see if he was truly worthy of the path he had chosen. The whispers in his mind grew louder, taunting him, tempting him to surrender to the darkness and embrace the power the entity offered once again. "You cannot escape," one of the creatures hissed, its voice like the screech of metal. "You are ours, Aldric. You are forever bound." Aldric's grip on the sword tightened. He knew that if he dove into fear, if he listened to the whispers, he would never find redemption. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, but he refused to let it consume him. With a battle cry, he swung his sword at the nearest creature, its form shifting and dissolving into shadow as the blade struck it. But the battle was not over. For every creature Aldric defeated, more emerged from the darkness, their eyes glowing with malice. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the very ground seemed to warp beneath his feet. In that moment, Aldric understood. The trials had begun, and the only way forward was through them. There was no turning back. He fought with all his strength, each strike pushing him closer to the monument, each creature vanishing as it was struck down. But with every victory, a part of him felt lost, his humanity slipping away as the darkness closed in around him. The curse was relentless, and no matter how many foes he defeated, the whispers of the entity only grew louder, urging him to submit. But Aldric pressed on, driven by the faint hope that there was something beyond this suffering. He had to believe there was a way to sever the bond. He could not let this cursed immortality define him forever.
After what felt like hours of fighting, the creatures finally stopped coming. Aldric, exhausted and covered in the blood of his enemies, approached the stone monument. The air around it hummed with a strange energy, and as he reached out to touch it, the ground trembled once again. But this time, it was not a growl he heard. A voice, deep and ancient, echoed from the stones themselves. "You have come far, King Aldric," it said, its tone cold and indifferent. "But the price for your immortality has already been paid. There is no escape. You belong to me." Aldric's heart raced. He knew this voice. It was the entity, the one he had bargained with. He had hoped for a chance to sever the bond, to break free from its grasp, but the entity's words crushed that hope. "You are mine," the voice continued, "and I will never release you. You sought immortality, and now you will have it forever. Your soul is mine to do with as I please. You will serve me for all eternity, just as you were meant to." Aldric's grip on his sword tightened. The entity's presence was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. But in the face of its power, Aldric felt a flicker of defiance. "No," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "I will not serve you. I will not be your puppet. I will fight for my soul, no matter the cost." The entity's laughter echoed through the air, dark and mocking. "You think you can defeat me? You are nothing more than a broken, hollow shell, a king without a crown. You have already lost. There is no escape."
But Aldric refused to back down. He had already lost so much, his kingdom, his humanity, but he would not lose his soul, not to this darkness. With a roar, Aldric raised his sword, its blade glowing with the last remnants of his will. He struck the stone monument, shattering it with a single blow. The ground shook violently, and the air filled with a deafening roar, as if the very world was protesting the king's defiance. And then everything went silent. The entity's voice faded, its grip on Aldric loosening. The whispers that had plagued his mind for so long were gone. In their place, a profound silence settled over him. He was free. But as Aldric looked around, he realized the truth. The entity's power had not vanished entirely. It had left its mark on him, a scar that would never fade. His immortality was not undone, but the curse had been broken. He was no longer bound to the entity's will, yet he was still a prisoner of his own existence. The journey had cost him everything, but in the end, Aldric had regained something far more precious than his immortality, his freedom.
Aldric stood amidst the ruins of the shattered stone monument, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The silence around him was deafening, but he could still feel the presence of the entity, lurking just beyond the veil of reality, its dark whispers swirling in his mind. He had struck the stone, shattered the symbol of his bond to it, but he knew the battle was far from over. The entity was not a being bound by the laws of mortal existence. It was an ancient, malevolent force that existed in the spaces between worlds, beyond the boundaries of time and space. It had given Aldric immortality, and now it sought to reclaim him. "You think you have won?" The entity's voice echoed in Aldric's mind, cold and mocking. "You are a fool, Aldric. You can never escape me. I am the very essence of your immortality. I am your curse." The air around Aldric began to warp, the very fabric of reality bending under the pressure of the entity's will. The ground trembled beneath his feet as the entity materialized before him, a shadowy figure with eyes that burned like fiery embers. Aldric's sword gleamed in the dim light, but he knew that this battle was not one he could win through strength alone. The entity was not of this world, and no weapon forged by mortal hands could harm it. "Then how?" Aldric asked, his voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest. "How can I defeat you? How can I free myself from this curse?" The entity smiled, its grin twisted and cruel. "You cannot defeat me, Aldric. You never could. The price for immortality is more than you can bear. You are bound to me now, body and soul. Your only choice is to surrender." But Aldric refused. His mind flashed to the moments of his past, his kingdom, his people, the love he had once known. He had chosen immortality in his fear of death, but now he realized that the true curse was not the inevitability of death, but the emptiness of living forever without purpose. With a surge of willpower, Aldric raised his sword and struck again, this time not at the entity, but at the very ground beneath it. The blade of his sword struck the earth with a resounding crash, sending shockwaves through the air. The entity howled in rage, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You cannot destroy me," the entity hissed, its voice growing weaker. "I am eternal. I am the darkness that will never fade." But Aldric,
fueled by the last remains of his humanity, pressed forward. You are not eternal. You are nothing but a shadow, and shadows can be banished. With a final desperate cry, Aldric swung his sword one last time, shattering the air around him. The entity screamed, its form dissolving into a cloud of darkness that vanished into the void. The whispers in his mind fell silent. The ground beneath him began to settle, and the oppressive weight of the entity's presence lifted. Aldric stood alone in the clearing, breathing heavily, his body trembling with the aftermath of the battle. The curse was broken, but at a great cost.
As the last echoes of the entity's voice faded into nothingness, Aldric looked around, his heart heavy with both relief and sorrow. The land was quiet now, the twisted, dark forces that had plagued him for so long gone. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. Aldric's immortality remained, but the world around him had changed. He was no longer bound to the entity, but he was still an immortal man, cursed to walk the earth forever. His soul had been freed, but the weight of eternity was a burden he could never escape. As he gazed into the distance, Aldric realized the true price of immortality was not the absence of death, but the absence of connection, the inability to grow, to change, and to truly live. He had sacrificed everything in his quest for eternal life, but in the end, he was left with nothing but the endless passage of time. The king who had once ruled with ambition and fear had now become a wandering soul, lost in the vastness of eternity. His kingdom was long gone, his people lost to history. His name, once celebrated, had faded into obscurity. He was no longer a king, but a relic of a forgotten age. But even in his solitude, Aldric found a strange peace. The curse had been broken, and he was free from the entity's grip. He was no longer bound by fear, no longer driven by the need to control time and death. He had faced the darkness within himself and emerged victorious. Now all that remained was to accept his fate. He would continue to walk the earth alone but free, forever changed by the choices he had made. And though he would never again find the kingdom he had lost, Aldric finally understood that true immortality was not about escaping death. It was about finding meaning in the moments that mattered, however fleeting they might be. The king was gone, but the man who had once been Aldric would live on, wandering through the ages, carrying with him the lessons of the past and the weight of eternity.